Well, good morning and welcome back to another week of Adult Sunday School at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. We are continuing in our trip through the book of Acts as we follow the early church after Jesus' ascension and see what they're up to in those early first years of Christianity. We have been going for quite a while now. We just got back from a little 1 week break. But we are moving forward with what is called Paul's second missionary journey. So last week we saw a conference in Jerusalem where this long brewing, or not last week, 2 weeks ago, was the conference in Jerusalem when we saw this long brewing issue with the place of Gentiles in the church finally mostly being resolved. There was a proclamation from the leaders of the church in Jerusalem asking the Gentiles to follow a couple basic instructions. Don't eat food that was sacrificed to idols, avoid sexual immorality, avoid the blood of animals or animals that had been strangled. And so Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and another fellow named Jacob all went back to Antioch from Jerusalem, and everyone seemed pretty happy with this outcome. So we start off now with verse 36 of chapter 15, where, Paul gets an idea. So sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit all the brothers and sisters in every city where we preach the Lord's word. Let's see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them, but Paul insisted that they shouldn't take him along, since he had deserted them in Pamphylia and hadn't continued with them in their work. Their argument became so intense that they went their separate ways. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left, entrusted by the brothers and sisters to the Lord's grace. So I told you a while ago that when John Mark left Paul and Barnabas, it would cause problems again later, and now we're starting to see those problems. Paul gets this idea to check up on everybody, both to see how everyone's doing and to bring news of this proclamation from Jerusalem. Barnabas thinks this is a good idea, but then he says, let's bring John Mark with us. We liked John Mark. But Paul was not a fan of John Mark. He was still holding a bit of a grudge from when John Mark left them the first time, and so he said, not happening. And they had a pretty intense argument about it, intense enough that they decided that they just weren't going to do ministry together anymore. It actually sounds a lot like the church today, where people get upset and decide that they're just not going to do ministry with each other anymore. But I will tell you, eventually, Paul and John Mark do work out their differences and they're friends again. It just takes some time. So here we have John Mark and Barnabas going off in one direction and heading to Cyprus, and then Paul going with Silas, who, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, in verse 33, it says that Silas went back to Jerusalem. And that's where I think this little added thing of verse 34 comes into play, where someone probably wrote in the margin notes just a little something that said, Silas decided to stay because Silas had apparently gone back to Jerusalem, but now he's apparently going with Paul from Antioch on a journey. And so they have reached this point. They are all getting ready to go kind of their separate ways, and they both start, both Barnabas and John Mark and Paul and Silas start sharing the gospel. We follow Paul and Silas quite a bit more here, and we find out in verse 41, he traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Paul reached Derbe and then Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy. So Paul and Silas are continuing to go through the same places really where this letter from the church in Jerusalem was written to. It was written to the Christians in Antioch, in Syria, and in Cilicia, and so they go up from Antioch through Syria and into Cilicia, which is this central region of Turkey. And they end up in going through Derbe and find themselves in Lystra, which is, these are both towns in kind of central-ish Turkey. This is a region called Galatia, which you might know from the letter bearing that name and every mispronunciation of my last name ever. And in Lystra, Paul meets this guy named Timothy. Now, Timothy was a young man, by which I mean he was 32. We often have this sense that because of Paul's letters to Timothy that he writes later, that Timothy was, 15, 16, maybe in his early 20s, but no, he's around 32 according to tradition. And Timothy ends up in a very interesting place because of the circumstances of his birth. So let's find out what those are. Timothy was the son of a believing Jewish woman and a Greek father. The brothers and sisters in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take Timothy with him, so he circumcised him. This was because of the Jews who lived in those areas, for they all knew Timothy's father was Greek. This is kind of a weird thing to have happen, especially right after this note from Jerusalem that said, all you have to do is, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't eat meat that had been strangled, don't eat meat with blood in it, and refrain from sexual immorality. The letter to the churches had nothing to do with circumcision. So what in the world is Paul doing here? Especially when he gets so aggressive about people who claim that everyone needs to be circumcised in the letter that he's writing to this region later. Well, Timothy is a bit of a weird case because Timothy's mother is Jewish. That means that Timothy is Jewish. Even though he has a Greek father, as far as culture was concerned, Timothy was Jewish, but he hadn't been circumcised. And that's a big deal for that community. So because everyone knew who Timothy was, they all knew who his dad was, they all know who his mom was, and because in this era, casual nudity was viewed a lot different than it is here in America. Oftentimes the way that you would bathe is in a public bathhouse. So an issue will arise at some point. So in order to not offend the people that he wants to preach to, he makes sure that Timothy is upholding the law of Moses because his mother was a Jew. He is also a Jew. So it is a weird thing, but I really think Paul's motivation here is that Timothy's physical status would be an issue for preaching the gospel. And also, Timothy's 32. He is absolutely old enough to be making this decision on his own. So whatever the reasons that are not made exactly clear, aside from the Jews who lived in those areas all knew that Timothy's father was Greek, it seemed like the right choice at the time. So continuing on with verse 4. As Paul and his companions traveled through the cities, they instructed Gentile believers to keep the regulations put in place by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and every day their numbers flourished. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the regions of Phrygia and Galatia because the Holy Spirit kept them from speaking the word in the province of Asia. When they approached the province of Mysia, they tried to enter the province of Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus wouldn't let them. Passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas instead. A vision of a man from Macedonia came to Paul during the night. He stood, urging Paul, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Immediately after he saw the vision, we prepared to leave for the province of Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So this is kind of a strange situation. They keep trying to go places, just kind of in that area of Turkey, but God doesn't let them. They're trying to go east. Yeah, they're trying to go east, which actually in my house, that's south, but you get what I mean. They're trying to go east, But the Spirit of God keeps having things come up, apparently, so that they can't do that. So they end up going to Troas, which is where the city of Troy from, Trojan horse and the Iliad was. And they see a vision of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come to Macedonia." And so they do. They decide that this is what God wants them to do. Instead of going east to Asia, they're going west to Macedonia. So continuing on, that reminds me, there's another important thing that happens here. All of a sudden, we come in. Now, it's just really interesting. Paul and his companions, they, and then all of a sudden in verse 10, we prepared to leave. Now, as best we can tell, this is when they all of a sudden, without any commentary, pick up Luke. Luke was apparently living in this region, and he starts tagging along for a little bit. Now, we're pretty confident that this isn't just like Luke grabbing verbatim someone else's account. We're pretty sure that he was actually there, in part because Luke generally has a commitment to accuracy, even though he doesn't always succeed. But the better explanation is really also simpler. Luke is writing the book of Acts, as he did the Gospel of Luke before it, as a letter. He's writing a letter to someone. And so now, as he's getting to this point where he is personally involved in the story, he just shifts pronouns from they did this to we did this. So for the next little while, Luke, the actual writer of the book of Acts, was involved with good portions of this story. So continuing on, verse 11. We sailed from Troas straight for Samothrace and came to Neapolis the following day. From there we went to Philippi, a city of Macedonia's first district and a Roman colony. We stayed in that city several days. So Philippi is named for Alexander the Great's father. And Macedonia is that kind of upper sticky outy bit of Greece. It's a region that had a lot of influence and still has some, but its influence had waned. And this is a very Roman city. That's a thing that becomes important for us to remember. This is no longer an area that was familiar with Judaism. This is a very Roman area. Even we find out in verse 13, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the riverbank where we thought there might be a place for prayer. We sat down and began to talk to the women who had gathered. So verse 13 here shows us that they didn't even have enough people in the city of Philippi to actually have a synagogue. Specifically, they did not have 10 men for there to be a synagogue, but there was a place of prayer and there were some women there. So what's going to happen next? So with verse 14, one of these women was Lydia, a Gentile God worshiper from the city of Thyatira, a dealer in purple cloth. So Lydia is interesting. These little details don't seem like they matter a lot, but we know that she's not a Jew. She is a Gentile, but she does worship God. So she kind of follows Jewish practices without actually being Jewish. She's also a dealer in purple cloth. So Lydia is a merchant who sells the cloth that makes the clothes for stupidly rich people. Purple dye was incredibly expensive to attain, and so only the incredibly rich, and in some cultures, and I can't remember exactly what it is for Rome, in some cultures, only actual royalty could wear purple. So this is a significant person with some significant resources behind her. Maybe not necessarily social resources, but absolutely financial resources, because she was a dealer in this incredibly expensive and hard to obtain cloth. So continuing on, as Lydia listened, the Lord enabled her to embrace Paul's message. Once she and her household were baptized, she urged, "Now that you have decided that I am a believer in the Lord, come and stay in my house." And she persuaded us. So now they've got a place to stay, which is always kind of nice, and they're hanging out at Lydia's probably nice house. But things don't always go so well, because stuff's about to take a turn for the interesting. So verse 16, one day when we were on the way to the place for prayer, we met a slave woman. She had a spirit that enabled her to predict the future. She made a lot of money for her owners through fortune telling. She began following Paul and us, shouting, "These people are servants of the Most High God. They are proclaiming a way of salvation to you." She did this for many days. Doesn't seem so bad, right? I mean, this is, if anything, you would think that this would kind of be a help to Paul and the rest of them. Because this woman, while she does have a spirit, she's saying, hey, these people have a way of salvation. I mean, isn't that basically what they're saying? That they're servants of God and they have a message that will save people? You would think that this might be a little bit helpful. But that is not at all the reaction that Paul has. Continuing verse 18, this annoyed Paul so much that he finally turned and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave her." It left her at that very moment. I have to think, I'm just picturing this in my mind, and I'm imagining that this isn't so much a woman who is saying, "These people are servants of the Most High God and they are proclaiming a way of salvation to you." But I get the feeling that it's more like when little kids get really excited about an idea and they just say it over and 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 over again. And eventually you just get really tired of it. Even if it was really cute the first time, after a while, you're just done because it just pokes and pokes and pokes and pokes and pokes and pokes and pokes until finally you turn around and cast out the spirit. Okay, maybe don't do that so much with little kids, but in this particular case, that's what happens. Because for Paul to do this means it was the opposite of helpful. And now this woman no longer has a spirit that told fortunes, a spirit that made powerful people a whole lot of money. So verse 19, her owners realized that their hope for making money was gone. They grabbed Paul and Silas and dragged them before the officials in the city center. When her owners approached the legal authorities, they said, "These people are causing an uproar in our city. They are Jews who promote customs that we Romans can't accept or practice." You know, a thing we often forget with our couple thousand years of hindsight is at this point in time, the Romans weren't the pagans. The Jews, and by extension, the Christians, were the pagans. They were the ones that did things that made the Romans uncomfortable. They were the ones that had different beliefs. And as far as that Roman majority was concerned, some of these practices were not right. They were, in fact, very wrong and very inappropriate to do. And it's just another of those hints that we're not in Judea anymore. Because in Judea, everyone kind of goes, yep, we're living in the land of the Jewish people and they have their customs and we just move on. But in Macedonia, in a major city that doesn't even have enough Jewish people to form a synagogue, it's going to be a little weird. And if you've learned anything about the entirety of human history, when a powerful group of humans encounters a smaller group of humans, especially if that smaller group of humans is weird and different, it does not go so well for the less powerful group of humans. So verse 22, the crowd joined in the attacks against Paul and Silas, so the authorities ordered that they be stripped of their clothes and beaten with a rod. When Paul and Silas had been severely beaten, the authorities threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to secure them with great care. When he received these instructions, he threw them into the innermost cell and secured their feet in stocks. So Paul and Silas, they're imprisoned, they're pretty well secured in prison, and they're being watched over. But here's where things get a little bit weird again. Verse 25, around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. All at once, there was such a violent earthquake that it shook the prison's foundations. The doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. When the jailer awoke and saw the open doors of the prison, he thought the prisoners had escaped. So he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. This might seem like an extreme reaction from the jailer, right? I mean, there was an earthquake, the prisoners got loose. That's not his fault. I mean, it's not the jailer's fault that an earthquake happened. But the Romans had an interesting custom. They were so confident in their system working that they assumed that if any prisoners got loose, the guards had to have been in on it. It's the only way that it could have happened because they trusted their system that much. I mean, remember what happened to the guards who were guarding Peter when Peter got freed by an angel. Those soldiers that were guarding Peter were executed by Herod. So this jailer knows what the consequences are. He knows that he was in charge of these prisoners. So for them to escape means that his life is now forfeit. But, now we get verse 28. But Paul shouted loudly, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." The jailer called for some lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He led them outside and asked, "Honorable masters, what must I do to be rescued?" Now, there's more than just them staying in prison that would have gotten this jailer a little bit interested. I mean, for one, they had been singing and praying all night, which isn't normally the reaction that you get from prisoners. You might be people crying out to their God for relief, but it doesn't sound like that's what Paul and Silas were doing. If you've got a bunch of prisoners who are singing songs rather joyfully, that's weird. And then when they were given the opportunity to escape, when they had the chance to get free of the jail cell that they were in, they didn't take it, which is also weird. And so this jailer is like, "Hey, you guys are different. And I've heard some rumors about you from, why you're in jail and whatnot, but what's different about you? What do I have to do to get what you have?" And in verse 31, they replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your entire household." They spoke the Lord's word to him and everyone else in his house. Right then, in the middle of the night, the jailer welcomed them and washed their wounds. He and everyone in his household were immediately baptized. He brought them into his home and gave them a meal. He was overjoyed because he and everyone in his household had come to believe in God. This is a cool story, but it also brings up a little fun aside. This everyone in their household phrase has come up a couple times. It came up with the centurion Cornelius, that he and his entire household were baptized. And it's been said, 3 times here regarding this jailer, that everyone in the household has been baptized. And so this is one of those sections that we as Lutherans get our justification for infant baptism, because it doesn't say everyone who was an adult in his household was baptized. It doesn't say everyone who was over the age of 13 or 10 or 8 or whatever was baptized. It just says everyone. So this is kind of one of those verses that point to the practice of infant baptism, while not admittedly saying it explicitly. But it's one of those things that we look at as Lutherans and say, yeah, this is a thing that the church has done for a really long time. So we're going to keep doing it. So moving on, verse 35, the next morning, the legal authorities sent the police to the jailer with the order, release those people. So the jailer reported this to Paul, informing him, the authorities sent word that you are both to be released. You can leave now. Go in peace. Seems like a pretty good deal, right? Except Paul has a bit of a problem. I think what's the best way to phrase the problem Paul has? Paul likes to run his mouth, because in verse 37, Paul told the police, even though we are Roman citizens, they beat us publicly without first finding us guilty of a crime, and then they threw us into prison, and now they want to send us away secretly? No way. They themselves will have to come and escort us out. So let's talk about Roman citizenship. Isn't this a fascinating topic? So Paul and Silas were almost certainly not full Roman citizens. And the reason why I say that is, in order to be a full Roman citizen, you have to live in Rome. This is not Rome. This is Philippi. Paul lives more or less in Antioch at this point. Silas lives in Jerusalem and was spending some time in Antioch. So they don't have Roman citizenship, but they do have something that is almost the same thing, that are called the Latin rights. And this is a system that sprung up when people from Rome and from Italy started moving out of Italy into the other regions, because they still would get some rights and privileges that the common folk would not get. But there's also another class of people who get these Latin rights, and that's typically freed slaves or members of the military. So our suspicion is, as we study this with Paul and Silas, especially for Paul, there are basically, there's two options. Either an ancestor of Paul was a freed slave or a soldier, and thus was given these Latin rights as part of either their manumission or as part of joining the Roman military. This is a thing that was pretty common, actually. If you had to be a citizen to serve in the military, but if you didn't have citizenship, then serving in the military would get it for you. So that's option one, is Paul was, he had an ancestor who was a freed slave or a former soldier, and because his ancestor had Latin rights, therefore he also had Latin rights. That's probably the most likely thing, because the other option is that Paul is lying through his teeth and hoping that no one calls his bluff. And I say hoping that no one calls his bluff because the penalty for falsely claiming Roman citizenship was death. So if he didn't have Roman citizenship, for him to pull this off would be huge. But it seems much more likely, given the lengths that Paul will eventually use his Roman citizenship to get out of some situations, and oddly enough, get himself into some situations. He probably was actually a Roman citizen with Latin rights. They did have some documentation. There was like a passport equivalent that would prove if someone was or wasn't a citizenship. I don't know if they carried that around with them like they carried a passport, but there were some documents that would prove his citizenship. And it seems like Paul actually has these rights. So what are some of these Latin rights that you get? Well, it varies a bit from province to province and area to area, but here are generally the rights that you have under the system of Latin rights as a citizen. You have the right to trade with other citizens at equal status. You have the right to marry other Roman citizens and have a right to be a legal head of household. Head of household is a very complicated Roman concept that I'm not even going to bother getting into, but know that being the head of a Roman household was incredibly important. You had the right to migrate, which means that you could move move inside the empire and you would not lose your citizenship status. You have the right that if you move to Rome, you can get full Roman citizenship and not just these Latin rights. Full citizenship, basically the extra perk you get is you can hold offices in Rome and you can vote in the elections for those offices in Rome. You also have the right to never be crucified, which is kind of nice, actually. You have the right to be tried in Rome for your crime, as well as a right to appeal a trial in a different jurisdiction all the way up to Rome. Paul ends up taking advantage of this later in the book of Acts, basically in order to get himself to Rome. And then the one that is relevant to this situation is you have the right to not be beaten without cause. There are some things that can lead to a citizen being punished for a crime, obviously, but they have to be convicted before they can be beaten. So I'm sure you start to see the problem, because they beat Paul and Silas, and now they're both claiming to be Roman citizens, and they're trying to send them away quietly, and Paul's not having it. So verse 38, the police reported this to the legal authorities, who were alarmed to learn that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. They came and consoled Paul and Silas, escorting them out of the prison and begging them to leave the city. So Paul and Silas, by announcing their citizenship, have caused some problems for the leaders of the city, because they beat another Roman citizen, which is bad. They could get in a lot of trouble for this if Paul and Silas wanted to press the issue. So they're just like, hey, we're really sorry. We don't mean it. We didn't mean it. We didn't know. We're so sorry. We're so sorry. You should have told us. We're so sorry. We're so sorry. Please leave the city before you cause more trouble. And that's precisely what Paul and Silas do. In verse 40, Paul and Silas left the prison and made their way to Lydia's house, where they encouraged the brothers and sisters, and then they left Philippi. And so they do what they ask. They encourage the people who are now meeting in this church in Lydia's house, and then they leave. And next they head off to Thessalonica, or Thessalonica. It gets pronounced in any number of different ways. And that's what we'll catch up with next week, with Paul and Silas, and apparently not Luke anymore, going to Thessalonica to preach the gospel there. So until then, have a blessed week, and we'll see you again soon. Bye now.